Dylan walked down the dark tunnels. The dim lights and dark patches no longer unnerved him. Instead, he just hurried through the tunnels until he arrived back at the cage the hybrid was in. "I'm back," he called, opening the door. The dinosaur looked up and seemed happy he was there. "Thank you. I was a little worried you wouldn't come back," it said. Dylan chuckled, sitting his gun down by the door, walking over and sitting down by the animal. "Well, after you've been pinned under something that threatens to kill and eat you, but then it doesn't, you grow to trust it." The hybrid leaned forward and affectionately licked Dylan's face in greeting. It then motioned Dylan to come closer. Dylan obliged and moved against the dinosaur's side and rested against its flank, feeling the rigid, dunkly osseous armor poking him in the back. "So, I said you needed a name. Well, I have one in mind if you want to hear it," Dylan said. "Really? Let me hear it." "Hate the current one," the hybrid replied. "Well, I thought it would perfectly suit you, since when I first saw you, you were almost invisible in them. What do you think of Shadow?" Dylan asked. The hybrid thought about it, tapping its finger claws on the floor lightly. Then he said, "I like it. That's my name from now on." He curled his body around Dylan, causing Dylan to chuckle lightly and rub Shadow's nose, which was as hard as a rock due to the placoderm armor that covered his head. Dylan couldn't help but wonder just how the people who made Shadow had worked out mixing so many different types of DNA into a single animal. The armor even covered parts of the Dilophosaurus crests on Shadow's head, mostly around the bases of them, but not all of them. Dylan was in awe of the dinosaur's genetic makeup. "Glad you like it. I thought you would," Dylan said, returning his focus to Shadow's name. Shadow purred and tightened his embrace ever so slightly. As he did, Dylan noticed Shadow's exposed ribs again. Shadow truly looked as if he was fed just enough to keep him alive and nothing more. "I'm sorry, I wasn't able to sneak down here with some fish, or anything for you to eat," Dylan commented. Shadow snorted gently. "It's okay. The company of a friend is enough for me to be happy." His glowing eyes looking into Dylan's own. That was another thing Dylan still wondered about as well. He knew that it had to be some form of bioluminescence, like a deep-sea fish, that resulted in the solid green orbs glowing in Shadow's skull. As they sat together, Dylan continued noting the other telling details about Shadow. The Utahraptor claws on Shadow's feet were intimidating, and Dylan was still grateful Shadow hadn't used them on him the day prior. Shadow's tail was long and, no doubt, was also a dangerous weapon, especially with those Stegosaurus spikes at the end, which grew straight out of the plated armor covering the upper side of Shadow's tail. Everything about Shadow, from his pointed teeth to his intelligence to his armor, screamed that he was made to be a weapon. Dylan also noticed for the first time that something had been burned onto Shadow's arm. The number 000001. So that was where the name came from. "Shadow, if I could get you out of here, I would. You don't deserve to be trapped here," Dylan said. "There's no sunlight or wind or space. I wouldn't wish this place on my worst enemy." Shadow purred a little in response. "I know, and I appreciate that. You know they were here earlier today, and they shocked me just because they wanted to. The man in charge of the ones in the white coats did it." "Sorry," Dylan said. "You don't have anything to be sorry about. You're not the one doing this." "If you ever got your claws on them, what would you do?" Dylan asked. "I'd kill them. Very slowly and painfully. I'd use my claws to cut them, maul them with my teeth, make them feel my pain," Shadow said, fantasizing about carrying out the act. The desire to carry out such an act and the want to unleash the pent-up rage was so strong, It made Shadow begin to shake slightly. Dylan put a hand on the dinosaur's nose, and the touch caused Shadow to calm down. Understandable, Dylan said. Completely. I know I'd feel the same way, and I'm the kind of person who just wants to make people feel better most of the time. Do my part to help, you know? Shadow brought his spiked tail around and added it to the layer already curled around Dylan. You're a good person, he said. The only one I've ever known. All the others, they're just evil. Dylan found that he still didn't understand. The scientists were most definitely the people in the white coats that Shadow kept mentioning. But if they'd gone against the law and made Shadow after the project was canceled, then that meant someone higher up in the Patriots' ranks knew about this creation. Dylan wondered, what purpose did they have for allowing the hybrid to be made? What goal were they trying to reach? Dylan also realized that he had no way of guessing who was in on the plot, meaning that for now, there wasn't anyone he could trust to report what he'd come across. If he told the wrong person, he might very well be silenced because it was clear that whatever was going on, it was being kept hidden by some who didn't want others to know about it. Version 2 will have more abilities. It will be faster, stronger, and more frightening. The new weapon for the new world, Ian told Jeffrey. Jeffrey had been locked in prison since the war ended. He had been Carl Newton's right-hand man in the field, or rather his lackey wannabe. Jeffrey had been just as fanatic and evil as Carl had been, but he had nowhere near the same leadership skills. Nonetheless, it was on his orders that the war between the Patriots and the United Communities had dragged on much longer than it should have, even beyond the point that the Patriots could have won. It lasted until the Patriots' own military had staged a coup and put an end to it, arresting him mid-battle planning. Jeffrey had thought himself Carl's successor, but in truth Carl had seen him as a means to an end. The man Jeffrey was speaking to, his visitor standing outside of the bars of his cell, was Carl's true, closest ally. Jeffrey had been locked up in the building that served as a prison in the city for 10 years, but he and Ian both helped in leading a small, covert group determined to take back what they'd lost. They only needed a chance, something to get the ball rolling, even if it was just a tiny nudge to make the Patriots move against the United Communities again. The True Patriots, the name of their little group, had plans. Plans for assassinations that the Patriots would be framed for and force them into a fight against the United Communities. Plans to unleash hybridized dinosaurs made with variant DNA on their enemies in secret and mid-battle. Though that part was still more far away than the assassination or small-scale terror attack plans were. What will you do with the current one? Jeffrey asked. Probably terminate it, or let it fight to the death against version 2, Ian said. Jeffrey seemed to like the idea. He thought it was too bad he wouldn't be able to see the fight from his cell. Will you breed siblings again as you did with version 1? He asked. No, Ian replied. Version 1's sibling was more of a bust than the one we still have, if you want to believe it. I wasn't too sad when version 1A was found dead that morning. Now with version 3, the idea of siblings is being considered due to version 3 being designed for a different purpose. Both projects are being worked on simultaneously, though the bulk of the research and development is on version 2, Ian said. Version 3 slightly pulled ahead, so we're compensating that and working to catch up with version 2. Excellent, Jeffrey replied. I also believe we could have an opportunity here, Ian said after a moment passed. How so? Jeffrey asked. Ian held up a picture of a tree. On it were the words, "We see." We've been finding trees like this lately, marked always with 2 words and 2 words only. They've been found scattered throughout our territory. A new challenger has entered the arena, it seems. Or rather, a new piece on this game board is now in play. Here he paused and spelled out his intention. We find who's leaving these messages and get them to attack our friends. Or at least side with us when it comes to that, Ian said. He then looked around the room. I should go now. People will be suspicious if they see us talking. And he walked away from Jeffrey's cell. Dylan's next patrol of the tunnels was ordered to be at night rather than during the day. Normally his patrol was just for earlier in the morning or in the afternoon, but that day his orders were 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. Once his shift started, he followed the familiar path to Shadow's cell, and when he got there, he called out to the hybrid. Sorry, but I was told to come here later than usual, Dylan said, entering the cell. That's okay. I knew you'd come back, Shadow replied. He was lying in the darkest part of his cell again, invisible except for his glowing green eyes. You look creepy just sitting in the dark, Dylan commented, stopping in the middle of the cage. Shadow stood and silently came over so he could be seen in the light shining through the bars. They sat down, and Shadow asked Dylan, I've been wondering about something. Why did you want to help me? Because you don't deserve this. You're trapped, mistreated, hurt, and experimented on. The people who made you think they can't do that because they think of you as a number, an object, and well, you're the only one in this whole city that I'd call my friend. Guess that tells you how much of a social butterfly I am, Dylan said, chuckling softly. Shadow pressed the side of his head against Dylan. Thank you. Means a lot, he whispered. Dylan smiled and leaned against Shadow's shoulder, stroking the dinosaur's head along the side of his crests. They sat like that for a while until Dylan broke the silence with a sigh. Shadow, I feel terrible that I can't help you. I've tried to think of something, but I got nowhere. And since I don't know who allowed you to be or why you were made, I don't want to risk telling everyone. Tried to figure it out, but I can't go ask people about it. I'm sorry, I guess I'm just too stupid to help you get out of here. Shadow stood up like he'd been hit, causing Dylan to fall onto the floor. Shadow stood over him before he sank down and stood on all fours, creeping towards Dylan with obvious and serious purpose. Shadow? Dylan said, scooting back a little. Shadow slowly crept closer until Dylan was backed into a corner. He pressed his snout against Dylan's face, and then he spoke softly. I want you to hear this, and hear it well. Don't blame yourself. This is not your fault. He continued, saying, I know you can't help me. Hearing you blame yourself for my problem just hurts me. So please, don't. We'll need more samples, Ian reported, closing the door to the lab's DNA storage room. Why? We don't have enough DNA in storage, namely dromaeosaurid DNA. We've used more than has been logged, it seems. Tim, you'll oversee the labs. I'll go set some traps. Hopefully we'll get lucky. And I'll return with fresh samples, Ian said. There's a lot of raptors out there, and their genes are close enough that I can work with any species I catch. Special or otherwise. Maybe we should just let this project go. The number of resources it would take to create the dinosaur you envision, Tim said, but was cut off. Is it April 1st? I didn't realize, Ian said, the sarcasm very evident in his voice. For a brilliant man, you're acting like the king's jester. After Ian left, Tim went to his office. It was small, but he had access to the cameras and looked. Sure enough, the trooper was again visiting the hybrid. He had watched their interactions on a few occasions, fascinated. Their interactions proved his proposed approaches had been correct. Trying to force the dinosaur to submit through breaking its will would not work. He was happy the hybrid had formed a bond with someone. He made a note in his notebook that it looked so content and at ease when the trooper came by. He'd never been one to abuse the animal, but he'd also never been allowed close enough to it to talk to it, and after the recent shift in Ian's aura, he hadn't reported the interactions. He wasn't going to tell anyone. No one would know, especially with Tim suspecting Ian's motives were far more ambitious and viler than he had let on. After listening in on part of Ian's meeting with Miller, Tim realized something was going on he was unaware of. He decided to begin playing a game of double agent, and if it got as bad as he feared it would, he'd spill the beans to the Patriots as a whole. He just had to uncover the conspiracy first, whatever it might have been. The first thing he did as an unofficial double agent was disable access to the security camera pointed at 000001's cage on all computers but his own. The plan was to make it seem like the camera had finally just failed like so many others in the tunnels had. No one would be able to watch the hybrid now unless they were right outside its cage. With a smile, he left the room and went back into the lab. If he was going to make Ian think he was still blissfully unaware, then he'd have to still work on developing version 2 for the time being. It was early morning, around 4:30 or 5. Dylan woke up, still lying against Shadow. His chest was rising and falling slowly under him as Shadow breathed in and out. Dylan hadn't realized he'd fallen asleep, so he quickly checked the time to make sure he hadn't been missed. Seeing he had a few hours yet before his shift was over, he closed his eyes again and settled back down against Shadow's side. He'd only just leaned back when he felt Shadow suddenly rising under him. Shadow sat up, his motion sudden and alert, looking with an intense gaze at the bars. "What is it?" Dylan groggily asked. Shadow had obviously picked up on something Dylan couldn't hear. For Shadow, it was the worst thing he could have possibly heard at that moment. Panicked, Shadow did the first thing that came to mind, though perhaps it was far from the most practical option, but fear of what might happen if they were seen together motivated him to run with his impromptu idea. He was close to blind panic. Had he been any calmer, he would not have done what he did next. "They're coming," was the only thought running through Shadow's mind at that moment. It blinded him to any other rational thought. "Shadow, what?" Dylan stopped when Shadow covered his mouth with a hand, standing up at the same time. The dinosaur looked down at Dylan and quietly spoke in an urgent tone. "Sorry, you're not gonna like this, but if they see you with me..." Shadow didn't elaborate further. He just scooped Dylan's legs right up with his other hand and lifted him away from the floor, raising the human so he was aloft above his head. "I just hope you know you can trust me. You'll be fine. Just don't move once you're inside," Shadow said, keeping his voice calm for Dylan's sake. "And Dylan, don't scream." He opened his jaws as wide as they would go. Dylan's stomach fell out from underneath him altogether. Thick strings of saliva strung between Shadow's deadly-looking teeth, becoming thinner as he parted his jaws ever wider. Too wide, it seemed. At the same time, Shadow kicked Dylan's gun to an out-of-sight corner of the room. Shadow, trying to be gentle but still using force, shoved Dylan's legs down into his jaws, pushing them into his gullet. The force nearly made him gag. It hurt. It hurt so much. His body was not designed for this. Dylan had no idea what caused this, and with his mouth still covered, he couldn't ask, but he knew what Shadow was about to do. Shadow was about to swallow him alive. No matter the reason Shadow might have had, this was something Dylan was not okay with in the slightest. As fear swelled within the pit inside him, he managed to let out a pitiful but fearful squeak. Shadow gave Dylan an apologetic look and even paused for a moment when he reached Dylan's midsection, looking him in the eyes as he silently tried to reassure his friend things would be okay. He continued to keep the human firmly but not painfully restrained in his claws, easing how strongly he held him for just a moment. Despite his apologetic look, within a matter of seconds, Dylan was forced deeper into Shadow's tight, nearly constricting throat. He thought he was going to suffocate. Shadow found the effort of swallowing a whole human painful for him, but he made quick progress. All the while, kept Dylan's mouth covered as long as possible so he couldn't scream and alert the approaching people. They're coming, they're almost here, they're going to find him. After only a matter of seconds, only Dylan's head was still in Shadow's mouth, and so Shadow took his hand away from Dylan's mouth, then he placed his hand on top of Dylan's head and shoved Dylan down the rest of the way, causing a great strain on his throat muscles. Shadow slammed his jaws closed and painfully gulped Dylan down. He already wanted to vomit. His body wanted to reject the huge mass he had just stuffed into it, and his starved stomach felt like it was going to rupture. The pain was perhaps among the most intense Shadow had ever felt in his life. Bile foamed out of his throat and into his mouth. Shadow forced himself to swallow it. Thick strings of it still dripped out of his mouth, giving him the look of some diseased creature. But he had timed it well. Shadow laid back down as Dylan landed inside his belly. Laying in a way that hid his full stomach from view, he pretended to be asleep, even though his mind was still rushing with panic that they would realize Dylan was there. He was also very afraid of them. His panic only became amplified as the reality of what he had just done hit him. Stupid, stupid, stupid! Why did I do that? That was the worst thing I could have done! I should have just told him to hurry up and leave before they arrived. No, they were already in the hall. They would have seen him and things would have gotten so much worse. They would have realized I've bonded with someone. They would have used him to get to me. It'll be okay. They'll pass by and I'll spit him right back up, and they'll never have to know. Dylan will be okay, and they'll never know. The thoughts passed through Shadow's head at a mile a minute, but he displayed no outward signs of his inner turmoil. A group of scientists passed the hall, muttering to one another about version 2 and version 3. Shadow didn't care what they were saying, nor did he pay close attention to them. He was still regretting his choice, wishing he'd have thought of another action other than what he'd just done, anything other than what he had just done. In his moment of total panic about the scientists discovering them, Shadow hadn't thought clearly. He decided that literally hiding Dylan away inside his body was very poor judgment now that the panic had ebbed away. But now he had to stay committed. He just hoped Dylan was okay, was safe. If only the group would just keep walking, it would all be over soon. Slowly, in a way that drew no attention to it, Shadow shifted a hand so that it was on his stomach, more to reassure himself than anything. Dylan was safe. He'd be fine. It'd only be for a few seconds. His stomach, his poor stomach, hurt so much. He was in more agony than he had ever been in before. His body was not made in a way to handle what he had just done to it, and Shadow wanted to scream and cry. But he kept still and pretended to be asleep. He was a good dinosaur, and he would protect his friend from them. Shadow's movements when laying down had been so precise that Dylan realized something was up, and Shadow had not eaten him as a meal. It felt as if Shadow was trying to conceal him. While that made Dylan feel somewhat better, that didn't change the fact that he'd been literally eaten alive and was very cramped in the dark, humid, and disgustingly tight stomach of the dinosaur. It was so tight that he couldn't move, could barely breathe, the only air in there had come in with him, so there was almost none, and unless he had forgotten all he'd learned in anatomy class, Dylan didn't even want to think about what the stomach acid he was soaking in would do to him if he stayed in it for too long. It all nearly made him faint from fear. Meanwhile, Shadow kept his eyes closed and hoped the scientists would hurry up and pass so he could spit Dylan out. His mind was going a million miles a second. Internally, he was screaming at himself and in pain, while outwardly acting like he was still asleep. Why did I do that? Why did I do that? I'm so stupid. I should have told him to run away before they came. No, they would have seen him. This was the only way I could hide him. Oh, please, just go on by so I could spit him back out. He knew what would happen if Dylan was stuck inside him for too long, and Shadow didn't want to think about that outcome. He wished he had noticed the voices sooner, so he could have told Dylan to leave, but he'd been sleeping so peacefully, and his awareness had slacked. By the time he heard the voices, the group had been just down the tunnel, and it was too late for Dylan to leave. He didn't want to think about what would have occurred if they'd seen Dylan exit the cell. If they didn't use Dylan as a tool against him to ensure he cooperated finally, it might have made him disappear for all Shadow knew. And now, in his panic, he might have caused a bigger predicament for himself. Just hope he comes back up easier than he went down. Oh, my throat is going to be sore for days from this. Shadow couldn't help but think. Dylan, despite being hidden from the outside, could feel how tense the hybrid was in every muscle that surrounded him. Having concluded Shadow was trying to hide him from something, Dylan continued to stay still, despite the pain he was in from being squeezed into a place too small to house him. The more time that passed, the more he began to feel like he was about to pass out. Dylan was giving Shadow the benefit of the doubt on this one. Eating him after spending a few days together didn't make sense. If this had been Shadow's plan, he would have done it right when they'd met. For a short time, Dylan thought that maybe he was starting to adjust, but then the muscular walls around him suddenly tightened even more. They compressed inward with force and made the thick acid rise as well. Now it filled more than half the space Dylan was in, and he began to panic. Groaning from the increasing pain, Dylan thought, "Shadow, whatever is going on, please do it quickly so you don't digest me." There was nothing else he could do but trust that Shadow was going to fix this. The only thing he could do was try to keep his head above the stomach acid. Drowning in stomach acid would not have been any better than being melted by it. Right now, drowning seemed to be very likely, as he was beginning to feel lightheaded from the lack of air available in his tight confines. "I trust you, Shadow. I trust you," Dylan said to himself. "You wouldn't hurt me. You wouldn't hurt me. You wouldn't..." The situation became worse when the organ suddenly compressed inward again, making the space even tighter. It had already been small. Dylan was forced to fold into a more compact ball than he thought possible. Any more, and it would become crushing. His bones were bending in ways they shouldn't, and his limbs were being crushed into his body in ways that prevented him from breathing. It was becoming unbearably painful. Dylan swore to himself as he felt his muscles and bones on the verge of tearing and snapping. Dylan came closer to having a panic attack. All senses of calm fled from him, as he realized Shadow's stomach was beginning to digest him. Despite the resistance he felt on his insides as Dylan began panicking, Shadow refused to register his presence. Shadow remained completely still and looked as if he was asleep. Why are they taking so long? Even with a good reason for eating him or not, Dylan knew Shadow couldn't keep him inside for much longer. If Shadow's stomach tightened any further, then he'd be crushed. Then it wouldn't matter if Shadow spat him back out or not. "Shadow, just handle whatever's going on, please. I don't want to die in here," he whispered, using up more of the limited air he had. The stench of what little humid air was available was awful, and Dylan gagged and dry-heaved every time he took in what breath he could. He had to control his breathing, or he'd use up what little air was available too quickly. So he focused on that and slowed his breathing. He decided to let Shadow worry about whatever was causing this mess. The scary part was that everything that had happened had occurred within a few seconds, and Dylan didn't know if he could take it much longer. Shadow, you're my friend. I know you won't hurt me. I know it. I know it. It seemed to take the scientists forever to walk past. Shadow tracked them with his hearing as his eyes were closed and his face was turned from them. But one man stopped outside of the cell, hanging back to gaze inside of it. After a few seconds, the man pulled out a small remote and hit a button on it. A moment after he did, Shadow felt a sharp electrical pain and he jumped. The man was shocking him. Dylan could feel Shadow writhing in pain and heard his begging growls and threatening snarls. His dark, confined world suddenly began shifting and Dylan was tossed and turned in all directions. Not drowning became a lot harder than it had been before. The pain stopped and Shadow, now splayed out on his belly, stared at the man, who held the remote aloft and had his thumb still on the button. The remote connected to an electrical system built into the cell's floor that was designed to shock regardless of where the occupant was inside. The man had an amused smile. "Wake up, Sleepy," he said. Snarling, in a rage, and momentarily forgetting about Dylan, Shadow charged the bars and rammed them at full speed. Shrieking, he stuck his arms through, trying to get his claws on the man, who just laughed. Realizing that the man might see his full stomach if he kept at it, Shadow stopped, dropped onto all fours, and backed up into the dark and collapsed back onto the floor. "You remember this? I fixed it after you broke it the last time. Works better than ever. Watch," the man said, and then he hit the button again. Shadow felt himself getting shocked again, and he tried to stand up on his hind legs. Instead, he fell backwards onto the ground. He laid there until the painful shock stopped after a minute or two. He whimpered in pain as the laughing man walked away, hurrying to catch up with the others. One of the scientists in the distance was calling back, asking if he had seen the trooper on patrol down there. Shadow watched him go, feeling rage build up again. Rage that had been bottled up inside him for years. Rage that he couldn't control once it had a hold of him. But he was too weak to let it take hold, and he just laid there where he almost passed out. "I just want to sleep. I just want to sleep." Dylan gave as powerful a kick as he could. His skin was starting to feel irritated. "Shadow, you're gonna kill me if you keep me in here any longer," he said. He didn't think Shadow could hear him, as he could barely manage to stay conscious. He wished Shadow would let him out, and while he wanted to let Shadow recover from whatever had hurt him, he was not exactly in a situation to stay where he was. The kick did its job, though, stirring Shadow back from the brink of unconsciousness. Remembering that he had to make himself vomit, Shadow stood on all fours, his full stomach swaying slightly as he balanced himself on his unsteady legs, and he began trying to make himself hack. After a few seconds of compressing his internal muscles with such forceful effort that it was causing extreme pain and strain on his body, thick slime and saliva began to fall out of his maw, dripping off his tongue and past his curved teeth. The volume increased as the mass in his stomach was forced back up his throat. With a powerful gag, Shadow spat Dylan back out of his jaws with a violent upward shove and onto the cell floor. Shadow then collapsed back onto his stomach, almost falling on his friend. He was about to pass out. Covered in slime and other bodily fluids, Dylan laid where he was for a few minutes, breathing in the cool, damp air and stretching his body out. He sat up, shuddered as he looked down at himself, and then said, "That's disgusting. Sorry. That was so stupid of me, but when I heard them coming, I panicked. It was the best place I could think to hide you. My creators were coming by. They saw. Who knows what would have happened. That's why I did it. I was so scared of what they'd do that I did the first thing I thought of to hide you," Shadow weakly explained. He was still in pain from both the electrical shocks, and the effort of swallowing and spitting up an entire human. He also sounded mostly out of it, his statements more of a distant and disjointed ramble. As soon as I'd done it, I'd really wished I'd thought of something better, he added. It's over. The very idea is making me want to vomit again. You had a perfectly good reason. I just wish you'd explained it to me first, Dylan replied, looking at him. Thanks for... Thanks, he said. Shadow chuckled, though it sounded strained. Believe me, I didn't want to eat you. Swallowing a whole human is not as easy as I was thinking it would have been. I almost didn't have the strength to get you back up. Well, happy to hear you didn't like it, because I never want to do something like that again, Dylan said, his voice slightly raspy as he spoke. He stood and added, Just glad it was you and not some other dinosaur, I guess. At least I can trust you. You're happy I was the one who ate you? Shadow managed to say with a little levity. Watch. That'll be the funny story you tell in a few years, Shadow added, his voice growing hoarser with each word he spoke. You know what I meant, you sarcastic lizard, Dylan replied, lightly chuckling while coughing. Once the coughing stopped, he spoke again. No, not even a little bit. I'm just saying that if it had to happen, then I am happy it was you. But never do it again. Shadow regarded him for a moment before he began stretching his jaws, trying to relieve the pain in his neck caused by his recent actions. I guess it was a good thing I did what I did, Shadow slowly admitted. As bad as it was the best thing. If he'd shocked the room while you were hiding somewhere, they would have noticed you, and who knows what would have happened then. It definitely would have had a bad outcome. Shadow, who? Dylan started, wanting to find out about the creators and the electrical shock, but Shadow interrupted him before he could ask his full question. Every time, Shadow said quietly, not letting Dylan finish. Does it every time. He has a remote that he uses to shock me for fun. It channels an electrical current through the floor, so I can't get away from it. I'm so sorry, Dylan replied sadly. What could he even say about someone conducting cruel acts like that? Go, before they find you, Shadow firmly said. Dylan patted his nose, saying, I'll be back soon. I promise. He reluctantly grabbed his gun, left the cage, and stopped outside at the bars. And yeah, if I had to get eaten by a dinosaur, like, if it was some rite of passage that I had to experience in this life, then in a way, I am glad it was you, he said, hoping Shadow would find the comment amusing enough to at least crack an amused smile, although saying it did cause him to shudder again. As he walked away, though, he couldn't tell if Shadow had even heard the comment. He appeared to be unconscious. The sight made Dylan sadder. He went down one of the pitch-black side tunnels, turning his flashlight on, before looping around to the area the scientists probably were. But then he stopped, knowing he couldn't show himself to them looking like he did. Walking back to one of the main tunnels, he got an idea. He turned the flashlight back off, dropped his gun to the floor, and then grabbed one of the old, rusty pipes on the ceiling and pulled down. He hoped it would be as weak as it looked. It strained under his weight, but then broke free, water shooting out with force. Dylan used it to quickly spray himself clean, and then he grabbed the rusty valve to shut the water off. A man in a suit ran around a corner. It broke! Help me with this thing! Dylan shouted over the sound of rushing water. The man grabbed the valve wheel, and together they were able to turn off the water. I Think you got a little water on you, the man chuckled, shaking water off his arms. Dylan took a moment to take in the appearance of the man. Oddly, Dylan couldn't remember seeing him before. He had neat, clipped hair, a freshly shaved face, and an upbeat smile. Obviously, he was a man with authority. Dylan's own writings described the man's appearance as, he looked like a young CEO of some corporation from the past, or how I'd picture one. He looked like he could sell anyone anything. There was also something shifty about the nice hair and clean clothes that put Dylan off, he also later wrote. He was certainly someone higher up in the political sector of the Patriots hierarchy, likely why Dylan couldn't remember ever seeing him and why he had access to the tunnels. Yeah, Dylan replied, pretending like that wasn't exactly what he had wanted. Damn thing near fell on me when it broke. Yeah, they break all the time. Going on 30-ish years without maintenance will do that, the man said. Name's Miller. You're the new guy who patrols the tunnels, making sure people aren't snooping where they shouldn't be, yes? Yeah, Dylan FitzPatrick. Miller leaned in closer to Dylan, looking eager and getting right to the point. Did you hear it screeching in pain? Gotta love it. It gets me excited every time I make it sing like that, he said, waiting to see Dylan's reaction. Dylan felt rage building inside of him, but he didn't show it. Instead, he said, as if he were indifferent, I don't think any animal should be treated like that. It's not an animal. It's a weapon, which is just an object for use. How it's treated doesn't matter, Miller said, holding out his hand for Dylan to shake. Dylan didn't. Instead, he just walked past Miller, telling him as he walked past, actually, it does matter. If you don't keep your weapon in good shape, then it might just screw you over. He walked the corridors until his shift was over. Miller watched him walk away, then pulled a walkie-talkie from his pocket. Let's get him out of here and get someone else down here. He's not a right fit for our cause. Didn't even seem to know what the hybrid was doing down here, he said with a growl. He lifted the set to his ear and listened to the reply, then said into it, You can't do it until the night after tomorrow? He lifted the walkie-talkie to his ear again. Miller sighed. Fine. Jeffrey was led 1 mile outside of the limits of the Patriot City to a large windmill that stood unchanged after so many years. Just as the sky above the trees was beginning to turn orange, he was blindfolded, and 5 men with rifles lined up roughly 10 feet in front of him. They'd come and told him this was going to happen the day before. Well, people never visit me, Jeffrey had said as 2 Patriot soldiers approached his cell. Shut up, one gruffly had replied. The other, a much younger trooper, had stepped forward, held up a slip of paper, and formally read it aloud. Jeffrey J. Carlson, you are to be executed at dawn tomorrow by firing squad for planning treason, arranging the groundwork for terrorist activities as defined by the law, and attempting espionage against both the Patriot States of America and the United Communities of Ohio, the soldier read. What? Jeffrey had replied, jumping to his feet. How had they found out? Did someone overhear at least part of the conversation with Ian? Did Ian rat him out to remove suspicion away from himself? I've come to take your last meal request, sir, the second soldier had said, feeling rather smug. You're not even going to give me a trial? Jeffrey had managed to sputter after a moment. The young soldier had just shaken his head. No. Let me see. What was it that your favorite person, Carl, used to do? He said, pretending to remember. Ah, yes. He used to say that due process died with civilization, and nowadays, you just took out a threat as soon as you discovered it. And now his hour was nigh. Ready? Aim! The same trooper who had asked for Jeffrey's last meal said. Once the squad was ready, he waited a few seconds, then gave the order. Fire! That morning, clear gunshots were heard for miles. Sir, why didn't we arrest Ian too? One of the troopers asked after the execution was done. We know he's the guy Jeffrey was talking to. Because according to our intelligence, he isn't the head of the group. He is only the second or third leader of this small group of terrorists. Jeffrey was in that other spot, and we don't know who's at the other head of it all. One of the prison guards heard Ian and Jeffrey talking about their plan. Something about version 2. Probably something to do with the hybrid project, the young soldier, the same one who'd read Jeffrey's execution notice and who had been placed in charge of overseeing the execution, replied. It was cancelled, said the other guard. The rest of the small group remained silent, but they were clearly listening. Officially, yes, but lots of the people in those labs are part of the group. I guarantee it, even if we don't know for sure officially. A lot of them were fanatics before the war, and the ones who weren't were swept aside by Ian. I'd love nothing more than to arrest him for the crimes we know he committed, then and now. But after hearing about his and Jeffrey's conversation, the council decided it wanted to learn more, so we're going to watch the people we're suspicious of and see what they're trying to do in secret. Besides, no hurry. We'd know if their fanatical ideals had spread among others. Seems to be only limited to the scientists and whoever is or are at the head of the whole thing. Doesn't seem like a very good reason to let this keep happening to me. Even idealists just talking about terrorist plots might eventually get riled up enough to actually do it. Look, it's not up to me anyway. The council doesn't think we need to be too concerned with idealists. Besides, as you said, idealists have their limits too. And if we go and arrest all of their leaders at once, who knows what might happen among the rest of them. It seems to be limited to the scientists, but truly don't know that for sure. The council unanimously thinks that for now, it's best to just let them think they've stayed under the radar. But what if their fanaticism for the way Carl and his council did things has spread to others? Again, currently there is no evidence of that, which is one of the reasons the council felt it was safe to just watch for a while longer. Still, I won't deny that I've started watching some people who were chummy with Carl before the war more closely, the young soldier replied. Reassigned? Yes. Guard duty on the wall for the time being, starting tomorrow night. You'll do your old assignment for the last time tonight because we couldn't switch other positions around for today. Understand, FitzPatrick? The colonel firmly replied, handing Dylan a written copy of the order. Yes, sir, Colonel, Dylan quietly said. To be continued. Thank you for listening to part 2 of The Hybrid, read from the Spinosaurus by the author. Please check out the other narrations linked in the cards at the end of the video or in the description. Thank you again for listening, and have a wonderful day.